Tonight was supposed to be another successful event for billionaire investor Alejandro Navarro, a room full of investors.
Before the story begins, let me greet you. Hello everyone. Thank you for joining me today. Stories like this travel across many cities and many lives. So before we begin, take a second and tell me where you are watching from. I enjoy seeing how far our community reaches. If you enjoy powerful stories about choices, relationships, and life lessons, please subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next one. Now let's begin. The Dumbo waterfront in Brooklyn glowed with light that evening. The large glass walls of the renovated warehouse overlooked the Brooklyn Bridge, and the river reflected the city skyline like a sheet of moving glass. Inside, the investor gala had already reached full energy. Music moved through the room while conversations flowed between groups of executives, founders, and financial reporters. Cameras flashed near the stage where several speakers had already shared their ideas about business and growth. Servers passed quietly between guests carrying trays of sparkling drinks. Every table held small gold name cards identifying investors from across the country. One name attracted the most attention: Alejandro Navarro, a Mexican-born entrepreneur who turned a struggling software startup into a global technology company. Over the past decade, his reputation had grown quickly. Business magazines described him as disciplined, focused, and relentless. When Alejandro stepped inside the venue, a few guests noticed him immediately. A reporter raised her camera. Two investors moved closer, hoping to greet him before the evening speeches began. Alejandro offered a calm nod and walked deeper into the crowd, adjusting the sleeve of his dark suit. From the outside, he looked composed, successful, in control. Yet he had no idea that before the night ended, one quiet moment across this crowded room would force him to face a part of his past he had avoided for 18 years. And the person who would bring that past back stood somewhere in this very room. Alejandro moved slowly through the crowd, exchanging brief greetings with investors who stopped him along the way. Most conversations followed the same pattern. Congratulations on the latest expansion. Questions about his company's new partnerships. Short remarks about the future of technology and finance. He answered politely, though his attention drifted toward the large glass wall overlooking the river. The Brooklyn Bridge stretched across the dark water, its lights reflecting across the surface below. He reached for a glass of sparkling water from a passing server. That was when his eyes shifted across the room. At first, nothing felt unusual. Guests stood in small circles, laughing and exchanging business cards. Some discussed funding opportunities. Others watched the stage where another speaker prepared to begin. Then Alejandro noticed her, a woman standing near one of the tall windows. Her posture was calm, confident. Her dark evening dress carried quiet elegance, and the city lights behind her framed her silhouette against the glass. For a moment, Alejandro simply looked. Something about her presence pulled at his memory. He tried to dismiss the thought. Brooklyn held millions of people. It was easy to mistake strangers for someone from the past, but the longer he watched, the stronger the recognition grew. The way she held her shoulders, the quiet steadiness in her expression. A name formed slowly in his mind. Jacinta. The realization tightened his chest. 18 years had passed since he last saw her. Time had changed many details. Yet he knew without doubt the woman standing across the room was the same person who once believed in him when his life held nothing but risk and ambition. Alejandro lowered his glass slowly. His heartbeat began to rise, because Jacinta was not standing alone. Beside her stood a young woman who looked about 18 years old. And something about that girl made Alejandro feel suddenly unsteady. Alejandro tried to return his attention to the conversation happening beside him. An investor from Boston had started asking questions about his company's next expansion. The man spoke with enthusiasm, explaining how several venture groups were eager to work with Navarro Technologies. Alejandro nodded once, yet he did not hear most of the words. His eyes had moved back across the room. The young woman standing beside Jacinta had turned slightly, speaking to someone near the window. The movement allowed Alejandro to see her face clearly for the first time. His breath slowed. The girl looked about 18. She wore a formal black dress and an investor guest badge clipped neatly near her shoulder. Her posture carried confidence that felt unusual for someone her age. But that was not what caught his attention. It was her face. The shape of her eyes, the line of her jaw, the quiet intensity in her expression. Alejandro felt the room shift around him. He had seen that face before. Not once, thousands of times. In mirrors, in photographs taken during business interviews, in the reflection of office windows after long nights of work. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. The young woman carried features that mirrored his own. Alejandro blinked slowly, trying to steady his thoughts. No, that made no sense. 18 years earlier, when Jacinta told him she was pregnant, fear had taken control of his decisions. His company had been fragile then, barely surviving its first round of funding. He chose ambition over responsibility. He walked away. He convinced himself the situation would fade with time. Yet now, standing in the middle of a crowded Brooklyn gala, Alejandro watched the young woman beside Jacinta laugh quietly at something someone said. And a question began forming in his mind, a question he had avoided for nearly 2 decades. Could that young woman be his daughter? Alejandro stood still for a moment, trying to clear his thoughts. The investor beside him continued speaking, explaining a potential partnership between 2 technology firms. Alejandro nodded politely, yet his focus remained fixed across the room. Jacinta had turned slightly toward the young woman beside her. They spoke quietly, sharing a calm conversation that looked natural, familiar. The young woman smiled as Jacinta adjusted a small detail on the badge clipped to her dress. The gesture looked simple, but something about it struck Alejandro deeply. It carried the quiet rhythm of a mother caring for her child. A slow unease settled in his chest. He tried to reason with himself. 18 years had passed. Brooklyn was full of young professionals attending events like this. The resemblance could be a coincidence. Yet every time the girl moved, the similarities became harder to ignore. The tilt of her head, the shape of her cheekbones, even the way she held her shoulders. Alejandro had spent years building companies, negotiating contracts, and analyzing complex problems. His mind had always relied on evidence and logic now pointed him toward one possibility. The girl standing beside Jacinta could be the child he never met. He took a slow step forward without realizing it. The crowd shifted around him as another group of guests passed between the tables. Laughter echoed near the bar, and the music changed to a softer tone as the evening program prepared for the next speaker. Across the room, the young woman began walking toward the central networking area. Her movement brought her closer to Alejandro. Closer with every step. Jacinta followed behind her, her expression calm but observant, as if she already knew this moment might come. Alejandro felt the weight of 18 years pressing down on him. Because in only a few seconds, the young woman would turn fully toward him. The young woman stepped into the center networking space where several guests had gathered. A coordinator from the event team approached her with a welcoming smile. The gala had invited a small group of student entrepreneurs to attend the evening and connect with investors. The young woman stood calmly while the coordinator spoke to the surrounding guests. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet one of our young founders joining us tonight." Several people turned with interest. Alejandro stood only a few steps away now, frozen where he stood. His mind struggled to stay steady while his eyes remained fixed on the young woman. She turned toward the group. For the first time, her face aligned directly with Alejandro's. The resemblance struck him with full force. Her eyes paused on him for a brief moment, though she showed no sign of recognition. To her, he was only another investor in a crowded room. The coordinator continued speaking. "She's part of a youth innovation program here in Brooklyn, and already building a startup focused on financial tools for small businesses." A few guests nodded with approval. Then the coordinator asked the final question. "Would you like to introduce yourself?" The young woman accepted the microphone with calm confidence. She spoke clearly. "My name is Elena Navarro." The sound of the name hit Alejandro like a sudden jolt. Several guests glanced toward him immediately, recognizing the connection between the young entrepreneur and the billionaire investor standing nearby. Elena Navarro, the last name carried through the room like a quiet shockwave. Alejandro felt the air leave his lungs, because only 2 people in that room could fully understand the meaning of that name. Him, and the woman standing behind Elena, Jacinta. She met Alejandro's stunned gaze across the crowd. Her expression remained steady, as if she had known this moment would arrive one day. And now, it finally had. 18 years earlier, Brooklyn looked different to Alejandro Navarro. Back then, he was not the billionaire investor people admired at the Dumbo Gala. He was a young Mexican entrepreneur with a single laptop, a small rented room in Williamsburg, and an idea he believed would change his life. Most mornings started before sunrise. Alejandro would sit at a small wooden desk facing the narrow apartment window, typing lines of code while the city slowly woke around him. Delivery trucks rolled through the streets. Coffee shops lifted their shutters. Subway trains rumbled beneath the sidewalks. His company existed only as a concept, a financial software platform designed to help small businesses track payments and manage expenses with simple tools. Alejandro believed thousands of neighborhood shops could benefit from something like it. But belief did not pay rent. Investors ignored his emails, banks rejected his loan requests, and his savings shrank each month. By late afternoon, Alejandro often walked through Brooklyn carrying his laptop bag, searching for places with stable internet where he could continue working. Park Slope became one of those places. The neighborhood carried a calm rhythm. Tree-lined streets stretched past rows of brownstone homes. Families walked along the sidewalks while small businesses filled the corners of every block. One cafe became his regular stop. The shop sat near the corner of a quiet street, its wide front window open to the afternoon light. Inside, the smell of roasted coffee filled the room while soft music played behind the counter. Alejandro sat there almost every day, laptop open, notes spread across the table, trying to build a future that still felt far away. And the person who would soon become the most important part of that future worked right behind the counter. The cafe in Park Slope followed a steady rhythm each day. Morning crowds filled the room with commuters grabbing coffee before heading to work. By midday, the atmosphere shifted. Freelancers opened laptops near the windows, students studied quietly at corner tables, and neighbors stopped in for brief conversations. Alejandro usually arrived in the early afternoon. He chose the same table near the wall outlet where he could charge his laptop. From there, he could see the counter where drinks were prepared and orders were called. That was where he first noticed her, Jacinta. She moved behind the counter with calm confidence, greeting customers with a warm smile that never looked forced. Her voice carried a steady tone that made people feel comfortable the moment they spoke with her. Alejandro watched the way she worked, efficient, focused, yet kind with every person who approached. Some customers knew her by name. Others returned simply because she remembered their orders. One afternoon, Alejandro stepped forward to place his usual order. Black coffee, nothing else. Jacinta looked at him for a moment before entering the order into the register. "You come here almost every day," she said with a quiet smile. Alejandro paused, slightly surprised. "I guess I do. You always sit near the outlet," she continued. "Working on something important?" Alejandro hesitated. For months, he had avoided explaining his situation to strangers. Most people did not understand the uncertainty of starting a company with no financial support. But Jacinta's tone held genuine curiosity. "I'm building a software company," he said. She raised her eyebrows with interest. "That sounds serious." Alejandro laughed softly. "Right now it's mostly just a laptop and a lot of hope." Jacinta handed him the coffee cup. "Well," she said, "every serious idea has to start somewhere." Alejandro returned to his table. Yet for the first time in weeks, his focus on the screen felt lighter. Because someone had believed in his idea. After that first conversation, Alejandro noticed something had changed in his routine. Before, the cafe had been only a quiet place to work. Now it felt different. Each afternoon when he entered, Jacinta greeted him with the same calm smile. "Back again?" she would ask. Alejandro would nod and lift his laptop bag slightly. Still chasing the same idea, their conversations started small. Questions about his work, comments about the neighborhood, occasional jokes about how much coffee he drank during long coding sessions. Yet over time, those small exchanges grew longer. Sometimes the cafe slowed down during late afternoon. When the rush faded, Jacinta would wipe down the counter while continuing their conversation from across the room. Alejandro learned she had lived in Brooklyn most of her life. Her family had moved to the borough years earlier, and she had grown up not far from Park Slope. She spoke about the neighborhood with quiet pride. Alejandro shared pieces of his own story. He told her about leaving Mexico to study computer science in New York. He explained how he wanted to build tools that helped small businesses manage their finances without expensive systems. Jacinta listened carefully, not with polite interest, with real attention. One evening the cafe closed later than usual. Alejandro was still working when Jacinta approached his table while stacking chairs around the room. "You've been here almost 5 hours," she said. Alejandro looked up from the screen. "I lost track of time." Jacinta glanced at the laptop display filled with charts and code. "You're serious about this?" "I have to be," Alejandro replied. "If this works, everything changes." Jacinta considered his words for a moment. Then she smiled gently. "Well," she said, "I hope it works." Alejandro closed his laptop slowly. For the first time since arriving in New York, the future did not feel like a lonely pursuit. Over the next few months, Alejandro and Jacinta spent more time together. What began as short conversations across a cafe counter slowly became something deeper. Sometimes Jacinta finished her shift and joined him for a walk through the quiet streets of Park Slope. The neighborhood carried a calm evening energy. Streetlights glowed above rows of brownstone homes, while small restaurants filled the sidewalks with soft conversation. Alejandro often spoke about his plans. He explained how his software platform would help small businesses track their payments without complicated systems. Many neighborhood shops struggled with financial tools designed only for large corporations. He believed he could change that. Jacinta listened carefully during those walks. She asked thoughtful questions about his goals, the challenges he faced, and the long hours required to build a company from nothing. Alejandro rarely spoke this openly with anyone else. Most people only asked one question: how much money will it make? Jacinta asked something different: why does it matter to you? Alejandro thought about the answer. My father owned a small repair shop in Mexico, he explained one evening while they sat on the steps of a brownstone building. He worked hard every day, but he struggled to manage the business side of things. I always believed someone should build tools that make life easier for people like him. Jacinta nodded slowly. That sounds like a good reason. The more they spoke, the stronger their connection became. They shared late-night dinners at small Brooklyn diners. They walked across Prospect Park, discussing their hopes for the future. Alejandro worked harder than ever, driven by both ambition and the quiet support he felt from Jacinta. Yet behind those hopeful days, another reality continued to grow. His company still lacked investors. Financial pressure increased with every passing month. Winter arrived in Brooklyn with cold winds moving through the narrow streets. Inside the Park Slope Cafe, warm light and the smell of coffee offered a small escape from the freezing air outside. Alejandro sat at his usual table, staring at a message on his laptop screen. Another rejection. An investor from Manhattan had declined his proposal after weeks of waiting. The explanation sounded polite, yet the meaning was clear. Too risky. Alejandro closed the email slowly. For months he had pushed forward with determination, believing persistence would eventually lead to support. But each rejection tightened the pressure surrounding his company. He rubbed his eyes, trying to steady his thoughts. Across the room, Jacinta finished serving the last customers of the afternoon. When the cafe quieted, she walked toward Alejandro's table and sat down across from him. Her expression looked thoughtful. "Alejandro," she said gently, "can we talk for a minute?" He nodded, though her serious tone immediately caught his attention. Jacinta folded her hands together on the table. For a moment she looked down, gathering the courage to continue. "I went to the doctor today," she said. Alejandro leaned forward slightly. "Is everything okay?" Jacinta lifted her eyes to meet his. There was both calm and uncertainty in her expression. "I'm pregnant." The words settled between them with quiet weight. Alejandro's mind froze. Outside, a car passed through the street, its headlights sliding across the cafe window. Inside, the room felt suddenly still. Jacinta watched his reaction carefully. She expected a surprise, maybe even fear, but she also hoped for something else. Hope that the man who spoke so passionately about building a future might also believe in the life growing between them. Alejandro remained silent, and that silence would soon shape both of their lives in ways neither of them could yet understand. The meeting that raises the stakes word, Target 300. The news Jacinta shared remained in Alejandro's mind for days. Pregnant. The word followed him through every moment of his routine. When he woke in his small Williamsburg apartment, When he rode the subway into Manhattan, when he opened his laptop and tried to focus on his software, life had suddenly changed direction. But the world around him continued moving forward without pause. One morning, Alejandro received an email he had waited months to see. A venture capital group wanted to meet him. The meeting took place inside a small office building near Midtown. The space looked modern but simple, with glass walls separating each conference room. Alejandro arrived early, carrying a thin folder of printed documents. His financial projections, product details, growth strategy, everything he had worked on for nearly 2 years. 3 investors entered the room shortly after. They greeted him with polite professionalism before taking seats across the table. The meeting began with questions about his platform, how the software worked, which small businesses would use it, how quickly the company could scale across the country. Alejandro answered with confidence. His voice carried the calm focus he had developed through months of preparation. One investor studied the financial model carefully. Another asked about expansion timelines. The third leaned back in his chair and watched Alejandro closely. After nearly an hour of discussion, the atmosphere shifted. The investors exchanged quiet glances. Then one of them placed both hands on the table. "We like your idea," he said. Alejandro felt a small surge of hope. This platform could grow fast if the leadership remains focused. The investor paused briefly, then he continued. "But building something like this requires total commitment." Alejandro nodded. He understood what they meant. Yet he also knew something about his life had changed only days earlier, and the choice ahead would soon test every belief he held about ambition and responsibility. The lead investor opened a folder and slid several documents across the table. Alejandro glanced down at the pages. Funding terms, projected investment, growth milestones. The numbers were far larger than anything he had seen before. This deal would give his company the resources to grow quickly across multiple cities. But the investors were not finished speaking. "We are interested in funding your platform," the man said calmly. "But we need to understand the founder behind it." Alejandro nodded. The second investor leaned forward. "Startups fail when leaders lose focus," he said. "Distractions appear, priorities shift, and momentum disappears." Alejandro listened quietly. The third investor spoke next. "You're young, you're talented, but success at this level demands sacrifice." The room grew still. Alejandro sensed where the conversation was heading. The lead investor studied him carefully. "Let me ask you something directly," he said. "Are there any personal responsibilities that could divide your attention during the next few years?" Alejandro's mind flashed back to the cafe. Jacinta sitting across the table. Her calm voice. "I'm pregnant." He hesitated for a brief moment. The investor noticed a pause. "Family responsibilities change people's priorities," the man continued. "There's nothing wrong with that. But investors need leaders who can give 100% of their time." The message was clear. They were not asking about business plans anymore. They were testing his commitment. Alejandro looked at the documents again. The funding would transform everything. Office space, developers, national expansion. The dream he had chased for years could finally become real. But the investors' expectations carried an unspoken condition. Success required complete focus. And complete focus meant no distractions. Alejandro leaned back slowly in his chair. Because somewhere in Brooklyn, Jacinta waited for his response to news that had already changed both of their lives. Alejandro left the Manhattan office building with the contract folder still in his hands. Cold air moved through the street as evening settled over the city. Traffic lights reflected against wet pavement, while people hurried along the sidewalks. Most of them moved with purpose. Alejandro stood still for a moment. Inside the folder lay the opportunity he had chased for years. Major funding. A real chance to build his company into something powerful. Yet his thoughts kept returning to the quiet cafe in Park Slope. Jacinta sitting across from him. Her steady voice when she said the words, "I'm pregnant." He began walking toward the subway station, his mind filled with questions. For months, he had believed success required one thing above all else. Total focus. Late nights. Long hours. Complete dedication to building his company. The investors had confirmed that belief only minutes earlier. But now another responsibility existed. A child. His child. Alejandro reached the subway platform and leaned against a metal column while trains rushed past on the opposite track. The contract folder felt heavy in his hands. He opened it again. Numbers filled the pages. Investment schedules, expansion plans, deadlines for growth. Everything about the offer pointed toward a future he had always wanted. A future where his ideas reached thousands of small businesses across the country. Yet another image appeared in his mind. Jacinta standing behind the cafe counter. The quiet support she had shown him when no one else believed in his plans. Alejandro closed the folder. For the first time since arriving in New York, his path forward no longer looked clear. Two futures stood in front of him. One built on ambition, the other built on responsibility, and choosing between them would demand more courage than any business decision he had ever faced. Later that evening, Alejandro walked through the familiar streets of Park Slope. The neighborhood looked calm under the glow of streetlights. Small restaurants still held groups of diners inside while passing cars moved slowly through the quiet blocks. Alejandro stopped in front of the cafe. Through the front window, he could see Jacinta wiping down the counter as the last customers prepared to leave. The same place where their conversations had begun now carried a different weight. He pushed the door open. The small bell above it rang softly. Jacinta looked up. Her expression brightened for a moment when she saw him, though she quickly noticed the tension in his posture. "You look like you've had a long day," she said. Alejandro walked toward the counter and placed the folder gently on the surface between them. "I met with investors today." Jacinta's eyes widened slightly. "That's good news, right?" "It might be," he replied. She studied his face carefully. "What do you mean, might?" Alejandro opened the folder and turned the papers toward her. "They want to fund the company." Jacinta looked down at the numbers, clearly impressed by the scale of the opportunity. "That's amazing, Alejandro." He nodded slowly. "It could change everything." Jacinta lifted her eyes again. "So why do you look worried?" Alejandro hesitated before answering. "Because they expect something in return." Jacinta waited quietly. Alejandro spoke carefully. "They want complete focus, no distractions, no divided attention." The meaning behind his words settled between them. Jacinta leaned slightly against the counter. "You mean they don't want you thinking about anything else?" Alejandro did not respond. Silence filled the small cafe. Outside, a car passed along the street. Jacinta folded her arms gently. "So," she said softly, "what does that mean for us?" Alejandro remained silent for several seconds after Jacinta asked her question. The cafe felt unusually quiet. The last customers had already left, and the staff member who worked the evening shift finished stacking chairs near the back wall. Jacinta waited. She had always admired Alejandro's determination. From the first day she saw him working alone at that small table, she understood how much the company meant to him. But now the situation had changed. A future no longer involved only one person. Alejandro looked down at the contract again. "They're offering a large investment," he said slowly. "Enough to build a real team and expand the platform across the country." Jacinta nodded. "That's what you've been working toward." "Yes." Alejandro took a breath before continuing. "But they want a decision soon." "How soon?" she asked. 2 weeks. The words carried heavy meaning. 2 weeks to choose the direction of his life. Jacinta absorbed the information quietly. Outside the window, a bus rolled past, its headlights sliding across the cafe floor. Alejandro finally looked up at her. "If I take the deal, everything changes," he said. Jacinta watched him carefully. "And if you don't?" Alejandro closed the folder. "Then I keep struggling the way I have been. Maybe the company survives, maybe it doesn't." The uncertainty hung between them. Jacinta placed both hands on the counter. "I'm not asking you to give up your dream," she said calmly. Alejandro held her gaze. "But dreams come with responsibility too." The room fell silent again. Alejandro understood the truth in her words, yet the investor's deadline echoed loudly in his mind. 14 days. 14 days to decide between the future he had chased for years and the life beginning to grow between them. 2 days passed after Alejandro told Jacinta about the investors and their deadline. During that time, both of them continued their routines. Alejandro worked long hours in his small apartment, reviewing financial projections and refining the software platform. Jacinta continued her shifts at the cafe, greeting customers with the same calm warmth she always showed. But beneath those routines, tension quietly grew. One evening, Jacinta asked Alejandro to meet her after work. Not at the cafe, at her apartment. The building sat along a quiet park slope street, lined with brownstone homes. Rain had begun falling lightly across Brooklyn, tapping gently against the sidewalks and windows. Alejandro climbed the short steps to the front door and knocked. Jacinta opened it a moment later. She wore a soft sweater and looked slightly nervous, though there was also a quiet excitement in her expression. "Come in," she said. Alejandro stepped inside. The apartment felt small but comfortable. A warm lamp lit the living room, while rain streaked slowly down the window facing the street. Jacinta walked toward the kitchen table. "Alejandro, I wanted us to talk somewhere quiet," she said. He nodded. They sat across from each other. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Jacinta reached into her bag and placed a small envelope on the table. Alejandro glanced at it with confusion. "What's that?" Jacinta smiled gently. "I went back to the doctor this morning." Alejandro leaned forward slightly. Jacinta slid a photograph across the table. Alejandro picked it up. It was a medical scan. The image looked simple, yet its meaning carried immense weight. Jacinta watched him carefully as he studied the picture. "There's a heartbeat now," she said softly. Her voice carried quiet joy. Because for Jacinta, this moment represented the beginning of a new life, a future she already felt ready to protect. Alejandro held the small photograph between his fingers. The image looked simple, a grainy medical scan with shapes that meant little to anyone unfamiliar with them. Yet Jacinta saw something entirely different. She saw life, hope, a future beginning quietly inside her. Alejandro stared at the picture longer than she expected. Jacinta leaned slightly forward across the table. "Did the doctor explain how far along I am?" she asked gently. Alejandro lifted his eyes from the photo. "No, almost 10 weeks, she said. Her voice carried a soft excitement. She had spent the afternoon imagining the future. She pictured a small apartment filled with laughter, walks through Prospect Park with a stroller, a child who would grow up surrounded by the energy of Brooklyn. Jacinta had not grown up wealthy, but she believed love and stability mattered more than anything money could provide. She expected Alejandro to feel some version of that same hope. Instead, he placed the ultrasound photo slowly back on the table. His expression looked distant. Jacinta noticed the change immediately. "Alejandro?" she asked. He rubbed his hands together quietly. "This is happening faster than I expected." Jacinta studied him carefully. "Faster?" "Yes." His voice sounded uncertain now. Jacinta felt a small knot form in her chest. "When I told you about the investors," he continued, "everything in my life was already at a critical point." She listened without interrupting. Alejandro leaned back in his chair. "My company could finally become real," he said. "This investment changes everything." Jacinta looked down at the ultrasound photo again. To her, something else had already changed everything. She lifted her eyes slowly. "This baby is real too, Alejandro." The rain outside the apartment window continued falling steadily. Inside the room, the distance between them had quietly begun to grow. The rain outside the apartment window grew heavier, tapping steadily against the glass. Jacinta sat quietly at the table, watching Alejandro as he leaned forward with both elbows resting on the surface. His eyes remained fixed on the ultrasound photo, yet his expression looked troubled. For Jacinta, the moment felt clear. For Alejandro, everything felt uncertain. "This changes things," he said slowly. Jacinta folded her hands together. "Yes," she replied. "It does." Alejandro looked up. "You know how fragile my company is right now." Jacinta nodded. "I do. Investors are watching every move I make," he continued. "They want proof that I'm fully committed to building this company." Jacinta studied his face carefully. "You are committed," she said. "No one works harder than you." Alejandro shook his head slightly. "That's not what they mean." Jacinta waited. "They want my full attention," he said. "No distractions, no responsibilities pulling me away from the business." The meaning of his words slowly settled in the room. Jacinta felt her heart tighten. "A child isn't a distraction," she said quietly. Alejandro looked down again. "I didn't say that, but that's what you're thinking." He remained silent. Jacinta stood from the table and walked toward the window. Rain blurred the view of the street outside as passing headlights reflected across the glass. Behind her, Alejandro spoke again. "I've spent years working toward this opportunity." Jacinta turned slowly. "And now you're afraid this baby will take it away?" Alejandro did not answer. The silence between them carried more truth than any words could. Jacinta walked back to the table and picked up the ultrasound photo. Her voice remained calm, though pain had begun to show in her eyes. "This isn't something that can wait for the right business moment." Jacinta placed the ultrasound photo back on the table. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Alejandro stared at the floor as if searching for the right words, yet none came easily. The future he had imagined for years now felt tangled with a responsibility he had not prepared for. Jacinta watched him carefully. "I'm not asking you to abandon your company," she said quietly. Alejandro lifted his head. "But you are asking me to become a father right now." Jacinta held his gaze. "I'm telling you that you already are one." The words hung heavily in the air. Alejandro stood from the chair and began pacing slowly across the room. His hands moved through his hair as his thoughts raced in different directions. "This isn't simple, Jacinta," he said. "I know. The company is still fragile. One mistake could collapse everything." Jacinta remained seated. "And walking away from your child wouldn't be a mistake?" Alejandro stopped moving. "You're making it sound like I don't care." Jacinta's voice softened. "I know you care about many things, Alejandro." Her eyes moved toward the ultrasound photo again. "I just need to know if this matters to you too." Alejandro felt pressure building inside his chest. The investors' voices echoed in his mind. Total focus. No distractions. The deal depends on leadership commitment. He looked at Jacinta again. She waited patiently, though the pain in her expression had grown harder to hide. "Alejandro," she said gently, "we're supposed to build a future together." Alejandro turned away toward the door. The rain outside continued falling, louder now against the windows. Jacinta watched him carefully, because in that moment, she began to realize something painful. The man she believed would stand beside her might already be walking in another direction. Alejandro stood near the apartment door with his back turned. Jacinta remained at the table, the ultrasound photo resting quietly in front of her.
When Alejandro walked away, Jacinta faced a future she never expected. But instead of bitterness, she chose
the ultrasound photo resting quietly in front of her. The rain continued outside, filling the silence inside the room. For a moment, it felt as though time had slowed. Jacinta spoke first. "When you told me about your dream," she said softly, "I believed in it." Alejandro did not turn around. "You said you wanted to build something that helped people." He closed his eyes briefly. "I still do." Jacinta's voice remained calm, though emotion had begun to break through. "I believed in you when no one else did." Alejandro finally faced her again. "I know that. Do you?" she asked. Her eyes moved toward the ultrasound photo. "Because right now it feels like the future we created together is the only thing you're unsure about." Alejandro struggled to respond. Every word he considered felt incomplete. Jacinta stood slowly from her chair. "You don't have to pretend with me," she said. Alejandro looked at her. "What do you mean?" "You're afraid," she replied. He opened his mouth to speak, but she continued. "You're afraid this baby will take your focus away from the company." Alejandro lowered his head slightly. Jacinta nodded once, accepting the truth in his silence. "I hoped you would see this moment differently." The room fell quiet again. Alejandro reached for the door handle. "I need time to think," he said. Jacinta watched him carefully. "You already have your answer," she said. Alejandro hesitated. Then he opened the door. Cold air moved into the hallway as he stepped outside. Jacinta remained inside the apartment. The door closed slowly between them. And with that quiet sound, the life they once imagined together began to break apart. The morning after Alejandro left, Brooklyn looked calm. Rain from the night before had washed the streets clean. Early sunlight reflected off the windows of brownstone buildings, and the quiet rhythm of the neighborhood slowly returned. Inside her apartment, Jacinta sat near the window holding the ultrasound photo. The room felt different now. Alejandro's absence created a silence that made the space feel larger than before. For a long time she simply looked at the image. A small life growing quietly. A future that no longer depended on anyone else's choice. Jacinta placed the photo carefully on the table and stood. She moved slowly through the apartment, gathering her thoughts. Fear tried to rise inside her mind, but she pushed it aside. She had always believed strength came from facing reality directly. Alejandro had made his decision. Now she would make hers. Later that day, she visited the same doctor's office where she had received the scan. The nurse greeted her warmly and asked if the father would be attending future appointments. Jacinta paused briefly before answering. "No," she said. The nurse nodded gently and continued explaining the next steps in her care. Jacinta listened closely. She asked questions about nutrition, health, and the months ahead. Each answer helped her understand the responsibility she now carried. When the appointment ended, she stepped outside onto the busy Brooklyn sidewalk. People passed in every direction, moving through their own routines. Jacinta placed one hand lightly over her stomach. Her voice was quiet, almost like a promise. "We're going to be okay." That simple decision became the foundation of the life she would build. Not out of anger, not out of regret, but out of determination to protect the child who would soon depend on her completely. The months that followed demanded strength Jacinta had never tested before. Pregnancy changed her routine in ways she could not ignore. Some mornings she woke feeling exhausted before the day had even begun. Other days her energy returned, and she pushed herself through long shifts at the cafe. Still, she refused to give in to fear. Brooklyn had always been a place where people rebuilt their lives through determination. Jacinta reminded herself of that every morning when she stepped outside her apartment. Neighbors greeted her with familiar smiles. Shop owners along the street recognized her from the cafe. Life moved forward one step at a time. At work, Jacinta continued serving customers with the same calm energy she always showed. Few people knew about the child she was expecting, but those who noticed the small changes in her routine offered quiet encouragement. Her manager adjusted her schedule once the pregnancy became more visible. "You shouldn't carry heavy trays anymore," he said kindly one afternoon. Jacinta appreciated the support. But she also knew the cafe could not be her long-term plan once the baby arrived. Late at night, after her shifts ended, she began studying business and bookkeeping online. Alejandro's dedication to building his company had taught her something important. Independence required preparation. She spent hours learning skills that could open new opportunities. Accounting basics, small business management, customer operations. Her determination grew stronger each week. When her daughter finally arrived months later, Jacinta held the newborn close and whispered the name she had chosen long before the birth. Elena, the baby's small hand wrapped gently around her finger. Jacinta smiled softly. The journey ahead would not be easy, but from that moment forward, she knew she would never face life alone again. Elena's childhood unfolded within the steady rhythm of Brooklyn life. From the beginning, Jacinta organized her world around two priorities: providing stability, protecting her daughter. The small apartment in Park Slope slowly filled with the quiet signs of a growing child. Toys rested beside the couch, books lined the low shelf near Elena's bed. Crayon drawings began appearing on the refrigerator door. Jacinta worked hard to create a home that felt warm and safe. During Elena's early years, Jacinta balanced several jobs while continuing to study at night. Eventually, her persistence paid off. A local accounting firm offered her an entry-level position, helping small businesses manage their finances. The work demanded focus, but also offered something she had never fully experienced before: security. Each morning, Jacinta walked Elena to a nearby preschool before heading to work. Their path passed rows of brownstone homes and small neighborhood parks where children played beneath tall trees. Brooklyn became Elena's entire world. Weekends brought simple routines: trips to Prospect Park, ice cream from the corner shop, afternoons spent watching street performers along busy sidewalks. As Elena grew older, her personality became clear. Curious, confident, observant, she asked questions about everything around her. Jacinta encouraged that curiosity, helping her daughter understand how effort and kindness shaped the world they lived in. Jacinta never allowed bitterness to enter their home. Alejandro's absence remained a quiet fact of their lives, but it did not control the atmosphere she created for Elena. Instead, she focused on growth. Each year brought small progress, better work opportunities, stronger friendships, and a daughter who continued growing into a thoughtful young person. Yet even within that carefully built life, one question slowly waited for the right moment to be asked. Time moved quickly as Elena grew older. By the time she reached middle school, Jacinta had built a stable rhythm between work and home. Her role at the accounting firm expanded each year as she gained experience managing financial records for local businesses. Many of her clients were small shop owners across Brooklyn. Restaurants, corner stores, family-run bakeries. Jacinta understood their struggles because she had lived through uncertainty herself. That understanding helped her build strong relationships with the people she worked for. Late nights still existed, but now they happened at her kitchen table, while Elena completed homework nearby. Sometimes Elena asked questions about numbers and business while Jacinta reviewed documents on her laptop. Jacinta smiled when she saw how quickly her daughter understood patterns and ideas. "You think like someone who enjoys solving problems," she told her once. Elena grinned. "Maybe I will start a company one day." Jacinta laughed softly. "You might." Their bond grew stronger through those quiet evenings. They cooked dinner together, shared stories about their day, encouraged each other through difficult moments. Elena also showed natural confidence when speaking with people. Teachers noticed her leadership in group projects, and classmates often looked to her for guidance. Jacinta supported every opportunity that helped Elena grow. Debate clubs, school business competitions, community youth programs focused on entrepreneurship. Through each stage of Elena's life, Jacinta remained steady. She never allowed past pain to shape the future she wanted for her daughter. Instead, she focused on building something meaningful from the life they had created together. Yet, as Elena approached adulthood, the curiosity she carried since childhood began returning in a new way. Because one part of her story still remained unanswered. One quiet evening in early autumn, Jacinta and Elena sat together at their kitchen table. Homework papers covered one side of the table, while Jacinta reviewed documents for a client on her laptop. Outside the apartment window, the sounds of Brooklyn drifted through the night. Cars passing, people talking along the sidewalk, the familiar rhythm of the neighborhood they had always called home. Elena leaned back in her chair and stretched after finishing an assignment. "Mom?" Jacinta looked up from the screen. "Yes?" Elena hesitated for a moment. Her expression looked thoughtful rather than upset. "Can I ask you something?" Jacinta closed the laptop slowly. "Of course." Elena rested her arms on the table. "I was filling out a school application today," she said. "There was a section asking about family background." Jacinta listened quietly. Elena continued. "It asked about both parents." Jacinta felt the weight of the moment she had expected for many years. She remained calm. "And what did you write?" she asked, gently. Elena shrugged. "I left the father section blank." The words carried no anger, only curiosity. Elena looked directly at her mother. "Mom, who is he?" Jacinta's eyes moved toward the window briefly before returning to her daughter. For 18 years, she had protected Elena from the complicated story behind that question. Not out of shame, but because she wanted her daughter to grow up without carrying the burden of someone else's choices. Now Elena was older, old enough to ask, old enough to understand. Jacinta folded her hands together on the table. She knew the moment had finally arrived. But before answering, she took a slow breath. Because telling the truth about Elena's father would change how her daughter saw the world forever. While Jacinta built a steady life in Brooklyn, Alejandro Navarro moved in a completely different direction. 2 weeks after leaving Jacinta's apartment that night, he signed the investment contract. The decision changed everything. Within months, the small software project he had once developed alone in a Williamsburg apartment began expanding rapidly. The investors helped him hire engineers, designers, and financial analysts who transformed the platform into a full business product. Alejandro spent nearly every hour inside a modest startup office in Manhattan. Whiteboards covered the walls with product plans and growth strategies. Developers worked late nights building updates, while Alejandro moved between meetings guiding every decision. The platform launched quietly at first, but small businesses across several cities quickly adopted the software. It helped restaurant owners track expenses, retail shops manage payments, local services organize financial records without complex systems. Within 2 years, the company's growth accelerated far beyond the early expectations. Investors increased their funding. Major business publications began writing about the young founder who built a financial technology company focused on small businesses. Alejandro Navarro's name appeared more frequently in headlines. He attended conferences in New York, Chicago, and San Francisco. His speeches focused on innovation, discipline, and persistence. From the outside, his life looked like the perfect example of entrepreneurial success. Yet behind the rising reputation, Alejandro built strict walls around his personal life. He rarely spoke about the years before the company existed. He avoided conversations about relationships or family. Work filled every available space in his schedule. For Alejandro, success required constant motion, because stopping long enough to reflect on the past would force him to face a choice he had made long ago in Brooklyn. A choice he had never fully allowed himself to revisit. As the company expanded, Alejandro's reputation grew with it. Financial news networks began inviting him to speak about entrepreneurship and innovation. Magazine editors requested interviews about how he transformed a small idea into a national financial technology company. His schedule filled with meetings and appearances. Some days began before sunrise and ended long after midnight. Alejandro traveled constantly between cities, speaking at business forums and investment conferences. Each appearance strengthened his public image as a disciplined founder who turned persistence into success. Photos of him standing beside major investors appeared in business magazines. One issue placed him directly on the cover. The headline described him as one of the most influential entrepreneurs in financial technology. Inside the article, Alejandro spoke about risk, ambition, and the determination required to build a company from nothing. Readers admired the story. The young entrepreneur who arrived in New York with little more than an idea had built something powerful. Inside the headquarters of Navarro Technologies, the environment reflected that success. The company moved into a glass tower overlooking the Manhattan skyline. The office space held modern work areas, meeting rooms filled with digital displays, and a large conference hall where Alejandro often addressed his growing team. Employees respected him for his focus. Investors trusted his leadership. To the outside world, Alejandro Navarro appeared unstoppable. Yet when the long workdays ended and the office lights dimmed, another reality quietly followed him. His apartment overlooked the East River, offering a stunning view of the city lights at night. The space was large, impressive, perfect for someone with his wealth. But most evenings, Alejandro returned to an empty home. Success surrounded him. Still, a quiet absence remained. Years passed quickly as Navarro Technologies expanded across the country. The company launched new products designed to help small businesses manage payments, taxes, and daily operations. Each release strengthened Alejandro's reputation as a leader in financial technology. Investors celebrated every milestone. The company's valuation climbed higher each year. Alejandro appeared frequently on business panels where founders discussed the future of entrepreneurship. His calm voice and disciplined mindset made him a respected figure among investors and executives. Yet the pace of his life left little room for anything else. Most evenings ended the same way. Late meetings, long review sessions with senior managers, quiet drives home through Manhattan streets. Alejandro told himself the sacrifice was necessary. Building something meaningful required dedication. Still, certain moments slipped through the routine. Sometimes during late nights in his office, Alejandro would pause while reviewing company reports. His attention drifted toward the dark window overlooking the city skyline. Those brief pauses brought memories he rarely allowed himself to explore. A small cafe in Park Slope, Jacinta standing behind the counter, the ultrasound photo resting on a kitchen table. Alejandro quickly pushed those thoughts aside each time they appeared. The company demanded constant attention. Employees depended on his leadership. Investors expected continued growth. Allowing the past to enter his mind too often would weaken the discipline he relied on to move forward. So he built stronger routines, more meetings, more travel, more projects that kept his focus locked on the future. The world around him admired the results. But deep within the structure of his success, one quiet truth remained. Alejandro Navarro had built an empire by moving forward, and by refusing to look back. By the time Alejandro reached his early 40s, Navarro Technologies had become one of the most respected financial software companies in the country. Offices opened in several major cities: New York, Chicago, San Francisco. Thousands of small businesses now depended on the platform he once built alone in a small Brooklyn apartment. Alejandro stood often on large conference stages, speaking to audiences of investors and entrepreneurs. Screens behind him displayed charts showing the company's growth, while cameras captured every moment for financial news networks. Awards followed, industry recognition, profiles in major business publications. At corporate events, younger founders approached him for advice. How did you build something this successful? Alejandro always answered with the same message: focus and discipline. He explained how every major achievement required sacrifice and commitment. Most people in the audience nodded with admiration. Few understood the deeper cost behind those words. After one major conference in Manhattan, Alejandro returned to his office late at night. The city lights stretched across the skyline while the streets below slowly emptied. He stood beside the large window for several minutes. Success surrounded him. Recognition, wealth, influence. Still, the quiet emptiness he felt during those late hours remained difficult to ignore. Before we continue with this story, let me ask you something. What do you believe matters more in life? Success, built through ambition, or loyalty to the people who believed in you from the beginning? Take a moment and share your thoughts in the comments. Stories like this often remind us that every major decision carries consequences, and sometimes those consequences return many years later, when we least expect them. A few weeks after that conference, Alejandro arrived at his office earlier than usual. Morning sunlight stretched across the glass walls of the skyscraper, while the city slowly came to life below. His assistant placed a stack of documents on the desk, along with several invitations to upcoming events. Industry forums, technology conferences, investor panels, most of them followed the same pattern. Alejandro reviewed them quickly while sipping his coffee. Then one envelope caught his attention. The card inside looked different from the others. Elegant, simple. The heading read, Brooklyn Emerging Investors Gala. Alejandro paused. He read the invitation again. The event would take place in Dumbo, inside a renovated waterfront venue overlooking the Brooklyn Bridge. It aimed to connect experienced investors with young entrepreneurs building new companies. The organizers wanted Alejandro to deliver the keynote address. He leaned back slowly in his chair. Brooklyn. The word carried memories he had spent years avoiding. For a long time, Alejandro kept his focus on Manhattan, where his company now operated. Returning to Brooklyn rarely crossed his mind. Yet something about the invitation held meaning. The borough where his early struggle began. The neighborhood where he once worked long afternoons inside a small cafe. The place where he made the decision that shaped everything afterward. Alejandro placed the card back on the desk. His assistant stepped into the office. "Should I decline the invitation?" she asked. Alejandro looked again at the elegant card. For a moment he considered refusing, then he shook his head. "No," he said. "Confirm it." The assistant nodded and left the room. Alejandro turned toward the large window overlooking Manhattan. He had no idea that accepting that invitation would soon lead him back to a moment he had tried to forget, and to two people waiting for him in Brooklyn. By the time Elena turned 18, Brooklyn had shaped much of who she was. She moved through the neighborhood with confidence that came from growing up in its streets, parks, and schools. Teachers described her as thoughtful and driven. Friends admired the way she handled challenges with calm determination. Much of that strength came from watching her mother. Jacinta had always led by example. Hard work, honesty, focus on building a stable life. Elena carried those lessons with her everywhere. Her bedroom reflected the many interests she had developed over the years. Photos of school events lined one wall. Certificates from debate competitions and entrepreneurship programs rested neatly on a small shelf. Above her desk hung a corkboard filled with ideas. Notes about business concepts, articles about startups, sketches for digital finance tools she hoped to build someday. Numbers and strategy fascinated her. Jacinta often smiled when she saw Elena working late on projects. "You remind me of someone," she said once. Elena raised an eyebrow. "Who?" Jacinta simply shook her head with a quiet smile. "Someone who used to work very hard on big ideas." Elena never pushed further during moments like that. Her mother rarely spoke about the past, and Elena respected that boundary. Still, curiosity slowly grew inside her. Not from resentment, from simple questions about where she came from. Friends sometimes spoke about their fathers during school conversations. Some complained about strict rules, while others laughed about family traditions. Elena usually listened quietly. Her life with Jacinta had always been full of support. Yet one part of her story remained incomplete, and as she approached adulthood, that missing piece began to feel more important than ever. Elena's curiosity did not appear suddenly. It grew slowly over time, through small moments that returned again and again in quiet ways. At school, classmates sometimes talked about family history during group discussions. Teachers assigned projects asking students to describe where they came from and how their families shaped their values. Elena always completed the assignments carefully, but one section often remained shorter than the others, the part about her father. She never felt angry about the missing information. Jacinta had given her a childhood filled with encouragement and stability. Still, unanswered questions carried weight. One afternoon, Elena sat in her bedroom working on a scholarship application for a youth entrepreneurship program. Papers covered her desk while her laptop displayed a long list of forms she needed to complete. One question caught her attention: family background, parent information. Elena paused. She filled in her mother's name immediately. Jacinta Walker, occupation, senior financial coordinator, years in profession, more than 10. Then her eyes moved to the next line. Father. The cursor blinked in the empty space. Elena leaned back in her chair. The room around her reflected the life she had built so far. Photos from school competitions hung on the wall. A notebook filled with startup ideas rested beside her laptop. Everything she had achieved came from her own effort and the guidance her mother provided, but the blank space on that form remained impossible to ignore. Elena looked toward the hallway where Jacinta worked late on client reports. Her mother had protected her from many things while she was growing up. Yet, Elena now stood at the edge of adulthood, and adulthood often required facing the parts of life that had once remained unspoken. That night, Elena stayed awake longer than usual. Jacinta had gone to bed after finishing work reports, leaving the apartment quiet except for the distant sounds of traffic moving through Brooklyn streets. Elena sat at her desk with the laptop open. The blank space on the scholarship application still bothered her. She saved the document and opened a new search page. At first, she typed simple questions: how to find a missing parent, ways to learn family history. Many results appeared: articles about genealogy, advice forums, public record databases. Elena read through several pages, absorbing information slowly. None of it gave an immediate answer, but the process itself stirred something deeper inside her. She was not searching out of anger. She simply wanted to understand her story fully. After a while, she closed the laptop and leaned back in her chair. Her eyes moved across the room. Photos lined the wall beside her bed. Most of them showed moments from her childhood: school trips, birthday celebrations, small victories from debate competitions, and student business events. Every photo included Jacinta. Her mother had always stood beside her, supporting, encouraging, protecting. Elena appreciated that more than she could easily explain. Yet curiosity remained. She stood and walked toward the hallway closet, where several storage boxes rested on the top shelf. Jacinta kept old documents and family items there. Elena hesitated. Part of her felt uncertain about opening those boxes without asking, but another part believed the answers she wanted might already exist somewhere inside them. She reached up and carefully pulled one of the boxes down. Dust lifted slightly as she placed it on the floor. Inside were photo albums, old letters, and small personal items from years earlier. Elena began turning through them slowly, not realizing that within minutes she would find something that changed everything. Elena sat cross-legged on the floor beside her bed with the storage box open in front of her. Inside were pieces of history Jacinta had carefully kept over the years: old notebooks, greeting cards, photographs from family gatherings. Each item carried a small story from the past. Elena lifted a photo album and opened it slowly. The first pages showed pictures from her early childhood. Jacinta held her as a baby in one photo. Another showed them standing together in Prospect Park on Elena's first day of school. Elena smiled at those memories. Her mother had always made life feel complete. Still, she continued turning the pages. Toward the back of the box, she noticed a small envelope tucked beneath a stack of documents. The paper looked older than the other items. Elena picked it up. Inside were several loose photographs. Most showed Jacinta during her younger years in Brooklyn. Some appeared to be taken outside the cafe where she once worked. Elena examined them with quiet curiosity. Her mother looked younger, but the same warmth appeared in her smile. Then Elena reached the final photograph in the envelope. Her fingers paused. The image showed Jacinta standing beside a man. They stood close together outside the cafe entrance. The man held a laptop bag over one shoulder, while Jacinta laughed at something he had just said. The moment looked natural, comfortable, familiar. Elena studied the man carefully. He appeared young, focused, and determined. But something about his face felt strangely familiar. Elena lifted the photo closer to the light. Her heartbeat began to rise, because the man in the picture looked like someone she had seen before. Elena held the photograph in both hands and studied it closely. The image had clearly been taken many years earlier. The colors looked slightly faded, and the edges of the photo showed small signs of age. Yet the details remained clear. Jacinta stood outside the cafe in Park Slope, smiling in a way Elena had seen many times throughout her childhood. Beside her stood the man, young, confident, holding a laptop bag while leaning slightly toward Jacinta as if they had just shared a joke. Elena focused on his face, the shape of his eyes, the strong line of his jaw. Something about his expression felt strangely familiar. She stood and walked toward the mirror beside her desk. For a moment she looked at her own reflection. Then she lifted the photograph again. Her heart began beating faster. The resemblance between the man in the picture and her own reflection was impossible to ignore. Elena returned to the bed and searched the envelope again. One more item rested inside, a folded piece of paper. She opened it carefully. Printed across the top was a name. Below the name was a short business card design. Navarro Technologies. Elena stared at the card. The name echoed in her mind. She had seen it before. Recently, during a school business event where several technology companies were discussed as examples of successful startups. Elena rushed back to her laptop and typed the name into the search bar. Within seconds, dozens of results appeared. Articles, interviews, photos. At the top of the page stood a clear image of the same man from the photograph, Alejandro Navarro, founder of Navarro Technologies. Elena leaned back slowly in her chair. Because the man she had just discovered was not only a stranger from her mother's past. He was one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the country, and he might also be her father. The days after Elena discovered Alejandro Navarro's name felt different. She continued attending school and working on her projects, but her mind often returned to the photo and the search results she had seen online. Every article described the same story. Founder of Navarro Technologies, one of the most successful entrepreneurs in financial technology. Elena read about the company's growth, the interviews he gave, and the conferences where he spoke about business strategy. Each photo she saw confirmed the same thing. The resemblance between them was impossible to ignore. Yet Elena did not confront her mother immediately. She needed time to understand what she had found. A week later, an email arrived that changed everything. It came from the youth entrepreneurship program she had joined earlier that year. Elena opened the message on her laptop and read carefully. Selected students had been invited to attend a major networking event in Brooklyn. The program wanted young founders to meet experienced investors and technology leaders. The event would take place at a waterfront venue in Dumbo, the Brooklyn Emerging Investors Gala. Elena's eyes moved down the email. One line caught her attention immediately. Keynote speaker, Alejandro Navarro. For a moment, Elena stared at the screen without moving. The same man she had discovered in the photograph. The same entrepreneur whose face appeared in dozens of business articles. The same person who might be connected to her life in ways she had never fully understood. The invitation allowed student entrepreneurs to attend as guest founders. Elena slowly closed the laptop. Her heart beat faster as a realization formed. The opportunity in front of her could answer the question she...
Success can build wealth, power, and reputation. But some decisions shape a life forever.
The opportunity in front of her could answer the question she had carried for years. But accepting the invitation meant something else too. Facing the truth directly. That evening, Elena sat quietly in the living room, while Jacinta prepared dinner in the kitchen. The soft sound of chopping vegetables filled the apartment. The routine felt familiar, the same calm rhythm that had shaped their life together for many years. Yet Elena's thoughts felt anything but calm. The email remained open on her laptop beside the couch. Brooklyn Emerging Investors Gala, guest founder invitation, keynote speaker, Alejandro Navarro. She read the message again. The event would take place in just 2 weeks. Elena looked toward the kitchen where her mother moved calmly between the stove and the counter. Jacinta had always protected her from pain. That truth was clear now. For years she had avoided discussing the past, allowing Elena to grow without carrying the weight of unanswered questions. But Elena was no longer a child. She stood at the beginning of her own future. And part of that future required understanding where she came from. She walked slowly into the kitchen. "Mom?" Jacinta turned slightly with a warm smile. "Yes?" Elena hesitated for a moment. "I received an invitation from my entrepreneurship program." "That's good," Jacinta said. "What kind of event?" "It's a networking gala in Dumbo." Jacinta nodded casually. "There are a lot of business events there." Elena watched her carefully before continuing. "There will be investors, founders, and guest entrepreneurs." Jacinta placed the knife down on the counter. "That sounds like a great opportunity for you." Elena took a slow breath. "The keynote speaker will be someone named Alejandro Navarro." The kitchen suddenly felt very quiet. Jacinta's hands froze on the counter. For a moment she did not move at all. Because the name Elena had just spoken belonged to a chapter of her life she had spent 18 years protecting her daughter from. Jacinta slowly turned to face Elena. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The quiet inside the apartment felt heavy, as if both of them understood the meaning behind the name Elena had just said. Alejandro Navarro. Jacinta studied her daughter carefully. "How do you know that name?" she asked softly. Elena hesitated before answering. "I found an old photo." Jacinta's expression changed slightly. Elena continued. "It was in one of the storage boxes in the closet." Jacinta looked toward the living room where those boxes were kept. She had placed them there years ago, believing the past could remain safely stored away. But time had moved forward, and Elena had grown into someone ready to ask questions. Elena spoke carefully. "I searched his name online." Jacinta closed her eyes briefly before opening them again. "So you know who he is now?" Elena nodded. "I think I do." The room remained quiet. Jacinta leaned against the counter, gathering her thoughts. "Elena," she said gently, "there are parts of the past I never wanted you to carry." "I know," Elena replied. Her voice remained calm. "But I'm not a child anymore." Jacinta looked at her daughter's face. For the first time, she saw not just the girl she had raised, but the young woman standing at the beginning of her own life. Elena continued speaking. "My program invited me to attend that event in Dumbo." Jacinta understood immediately. "And you want to go?" Elena nodded. "I want to see him." Jacinta felt a wave of emotion move through her chest. Fear, concern, memories she had carefully kept buried. Yet she also understood something important. This moment no longer belonged only to her. It belonged to Elena too. Jacinta walked slowly to the kitchen table and sat down. Elena remained standing nearby, waiting for her response. For years Jacinta had prepared herself for this moment. She knew that one day Elena would grow curious about the father she had never known. Still, knowing the moment would come did not make it easier. "Elena," Jacinta said quietly, "meeting him might not give you the answers you expect." Elena pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "I understand that." Jacinta studied her daughter's expression. "You've built a strong life," she continued. "You've worked hard for every opportunity in front of you." Elena nodded. "And I'm grateful for everything you've done for me." Jacinta felt both pride and worry in that moment. "I just don't want you getting hurt." Elena leaned forward slightly. "I'm not going there expecting anything from him." "Then why go?" Jacinta asked. Elena paused before answering. "Because I want to see the truth for myself." Jacinta lowered her eyes briefly. She remembered the young man Alejandro once was. Ambitious, focused, determined to build a future no matter the cost. Those qualities had helped him succeed. but they had also created the distance that separated their lives. Jacinta lifted her gaze again. Are you planning to confront him? Elena shook her head. No. What will you do then? I'll listen to him speak, Elena said. I'll watch how he carries himself. Jacinta remained silent for a moment. Then she asked the question that mattered most. And if he doesn't recognize you? Elena answered calmly. That's something I'm prepared for. Jacinta took a slow breath. Her instinct as a mother wanted to protect Elena from the past. But protecting her now meant allowing her to face it. 2 weeks later, the Brooklyn waterfront shimmered with evening lights. The Dumbo district buzzed with energy as guests arrived for the Brooklyn Emerging Investors Gala. The renovated warehouse venue stood beside the East River, its tall glass walls revealing a clear view of the Brooklyn Bridge glowing against the night sky. Inside the building, staff members prepared the final details. Tables stood arranged across the large hall. Soft music drifted through the space while investors, entrepreneurs, and media guests began arriving in steady waves. Outside, a yellow taxi pulled slowly to the curb. Elena stepped out carefully. She wore a simple black dress chosen earlier that afternoon. Her student founder badge rested neatly near her shoulder, marking her as one of the young entrepreneurs invited to attend. For a moment she stood still on the sidewalk. The river breeze carried the sounds of the city across the waterfront. Brooklyn Bridge lights reflected across the water, while cars moved quietly along the street behind her. Inside the venue waited the man whose name had followed her thoughts for weeks, Alejandro Navarro, her father. Or at least the man who might be. Across the street, Jacinta watched from a distance. She had insisted on coming with Elena, though she promised not to enter the event itself. Elena turned toward her mother briefly. Jacinta offered a calm nod of support. Courage mixed with anxiety inside Elena's chest, but her decision was already made. She walked toward the entrance. Event staff greeted her and scanned her badge before opening the door. Warm light spilled out from inside the hall. Elena stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the room where the past and present were finally about to meet. The gala hall glowed with soft gold lighting as Elena stepped inside. Large glass walls stretched along the side of the venue, revealing the Brooklyn Bridge shining above the dark river outside. The reflection of city lights danced across the water while music filled the room. Investors and entrepreneurs moved through the space in small groups. Conversations flowed around tables where drinks and business cards passed from hand to hand. Elena paused near the entrance, taking in the atmosphere. Her badge identified her as a guest founder from the Youth Entrepreneurship Program. Several other students stood nearby speaking with event coordinators who guided them toward the networking area. Everything felt larger than she expected. Professional, energetic, important. Yet Elena's focus remained on one person, Alejandro Navarro. Across the hall, a stage stood ready for the keynote address. A large screen behind it displayed the name of the event, along with the logos of the company supporting it. Elena moved slowly through the crowd, listening to conversations around her. Some people discussed new startup investments. Others debated trends in financial technology. And more than once she heard the same name mentioned with admiration. Alejandro Navarro should be arriving soon. He built an incredible company. I'm hoping to speak with him tonight. Elena felt her heartbeat quicken. Every step carried her closer to the moment she had imagined for weeks. Across the room, a small group of reporters suddenly shifted their attention toward the entrance. Camera flashes appeared. A quiet ripple moved through the crowd. Elena turned. Alejandro Navarro had just entered the gala. The same man she had seen in the photograph. The same face she had studied in countless articles online. Except now, he stood only a few steps away, walking through the same room where she waited. Recognition without understanding word target 300. Alejandro stepped deeper into the gala hall as several investors greeted him. Navarro, good to see you. We've been looking forward to your talk tonight. He shook hands politely and exchanged brief remarks, the calm confidence of a seasoned executive visible in every movement. Yet something about the room felt different to him. Perhaps it was the return to Brooklyn after so many years. Perhaps it was the quiet sense that the borough held memories he had spent years avoiding. He accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server and continued walking through the crowd. That was when his eyes landed on Elena. She stood near the central networking area, speaking with two young founders from the entrepreneurship program. At first, the moment meant nothing. Alejandro often met young entrepreneurs at events like this. Their excitement reminded him of his own early days, building a company with limited resources. But as Elena turned slightly toward the light, something unexpected caught his attention. Her face, the shape of her eyes, the confident way she held herself. Alejandro slowed his steps. A strange sense of familiarity crossed his mind. Elena noticed him at the same moment. Their eyes met briefly across the room. For Elena, the moment carried enormous weight. She recognized him immediately. The same face from the photograph. The same person she had seen in dozens of interviews and articles. But Alejandro saw only a young entrepreneur, watching him with quiet focus. He offered a polite nod before turning to greet another investor, who approached from the side. Elena remained where she stood. Her hands rested calmly at her sides, though her heart beat faster with every passing second, because the man standing only a few steps away had no idea who she truly was. Yet, a coordinator from the Youth Entrepreneurship Program approached the small group where Elena stood. "Everyone," she said warmly, "we'd like to introduce our student founders to a few investors before the keynote begins." The young entrepreneurs gathered closer together. Elena felt a quiet tension rising in her chest. Across the room, Alejandro had finished speaking with several guests and now stood near the central networking area. The coordinator guided the students toward him. "Mr. Navarro," she said with professional enthusiasm, "these are some of the founders from the youth program we told you about." Alejandro turned with a polite smile. "I'm glad you're here tonight," he said. The students introduced themselves one by one. Each spoke briefly about the project they were developing. Alejandro listened with interest, offering small pieces of advice and encouragement. Supporting young founders had become something he genuinely enjoyed during events like this. Then, Elena stepped forward. The room around her seemed to quiet slightly. Alejandro looked directly at her for the first time at close range. Something about her presence caught his attention again. Confidence, focus, a calm energy that felt strangely familiar. Elena held his gaze steadily. "My name is Elena Navarro," she said. For a second, Alejandro did not react. The name passed through his mind like any other introduction. Then the realization struck him. Navarro, the same last name. His expression changed slightly. He studied her face more closely now. The resemblance became impossible to ignore. The shape of her eyes, the structure of her features, a reflection of himself from years earlier. Around them, the conversation slowed as several guests noticed the sudden shift in Alejandro's attention. Elena remained calm, but the truth had already begun revealing itself in his mind. Alejandro stared at Elena for a moment longer than the situation required. The name echoed again in his mind. Elena Navarro. The young woman stood calmly in front of him, her expression steady, while the other student founders watched the interaction with polite curiosity. Something about the moment felt unusual. Alejandro's mind moved quickly through possibilities. Coincidence. Shared last name. Nothing more. But the longer he looked at her face, the harder it became to dismiss the resemblance. The same sharp line of the jaw. The same focused eyes. Features he had seen in mirrors his entire life. The room around them continued moving with soft conversations and quiet laughter. Yet Alejandro felt as though everything had slowed. Elena noticed the change in his expression. Recognition had begun forming in his mind. Guests nearby started whispering quietly among themselves. Did she say Navarro? Is she related to him? The tension spread gently through the crowd. Across the room, another figure entered the hall. Jacinta. She had promised Elena she would remain outside, but the moment had pulled her closer than she expected. She stood near the back of the room, watching silently. Her eyes moved between Alejandro and Elena. Alejandro finally spoke again. "Navarro?" he repeated slowly. Elena nodded once. Yes. The simple answer carried enormous meaning. Alejandro felt a strange pressure building inside his chest. The past he had spent years avoiding now stood directly in front of him. Before the story continues, let me ask you something. If you were in Alejandro's position right now, what would you do? Would you face the truth immediately? Or would you step away from a moment that could change your entire life? Share your thoughts in the comments. The tension around Alejandro and Elena grew noticeable. People nearby pretended to continue their conversations, yet many of them watched quietly. Business events rarely held personal moments like this, and the shift in Alejandro's expression had not gone unnoticed. Elena remained calm. She had imagined this moment many times over the past weeks, yet standing face to face with him felt heavier than she expected. Alejandro's voice sounded quieter now. "What brings you to this event?" he asked. Elena answered clearly. "I was invited through a youth entrepreneurship program." Alejandro nodded slowly. "That's impressive." He paused again. The resemblance continued to press against his thoughts. Then his eyes shifted slightly beyond Elena. At the back of the room he saw a familiar figure, Jacinta. For a moment, Alejandro could not breathe. The years between them disappeared instantly. She stood quietly near the glass wall, her posture steady as she watched the scene unfold. Alejandro's mind rushed backward through memories he had spent nearly 2 decades avoiding. The cafe in Park Slope, late-night conversations, the ultrasound photo on the kitchen table, the door closing behind him. He returned his attention to Elena. Now the truth felt impossible to ignore. The young woman in front of him, the woman watching silently behind her. Past and present had collided in the center of a crowded gala. Guests around them sensed the emotional shift even without understanding the full story. Whispers moved softly through the room. Alejandro's voice carried uncertainty when he spoke again. "Elena," he said slowly. "Yes," she replied. Alejandro hesitated, but Elena had not come to the event for small talk. She had come for answers, and the question she had carried for 18 years was finally ready to be asked. The crowd around Alejandro and Elena had grown quiet. People nearby sensed the emotional weight forming between them, even if they did not fully understand why. Alejandro looked from Elena to Jacinta, standing near the glass wall. 18 years had passed since he last saw her. Time had changed many things, but the connection between those two faces now stood clear in front of him. Elena took a slow breath. Her voice remained calm. "Mr. Navarro," she said. Alejandro answered quietly, "Yes." She held his gaze. "My mother is Jacinta Walker." The words settled into the room like a quiet echo. Alejandro felt the truth land fully in his chest. For years he had buried that part of his past under layers of success and responsibility. Now it stood directly in front of him. He looked again toward Jacinta. She did not move closer. She simply watched, allowing the moment to belong to Elena. The young woman spoke again. "I didn't come here to embarrass you." Alejandro listened carefully. "I came because I wanted to understand something." The room felt completely still now. Even the music from the far side of the hall faded into the background. Elena's next words carried the question she had carried her entire life. "Why did you leave?" Alejandro felt the weight of every year that had passed since that night in Brooklyn. He had faced investors, competitors, and difficult business negotiations without hesitation. But this moment demanded something different. Honesty. He looked down briefly before lifting his eyes again. "Because I was afraid," he said quietly. The admission surprised even himself. For the first time in 18 years, Alejandro Navarro spoke the truth he had spent his entire career avoiding. Alejandro stood still in the center of the gala hall. The bright lights above reflected softly across the glass walls behind him, but his attention remained fixed on Elena. "I was afraid," he repeated quietly. The words carried none of the confidence he usually showed during business speeches or interviews. Elena listened without interrupting. Jacinta remained at the back of the room, her expression calm but watchful. Alejandro continued, "When your mother told me about the pregnancy, my company was barely surviving," he said. "Investors were offering funding, but they expected complete focus." Elena's voice remained steady. "So you chose the company?" Alejandro nodded slowly. "Yes." He did not try to soften the truth. "At the time I believed success would fix everything later," he said. "I convinced myself I could build the company first and deal with the rest afterward." Jacinta stepped a little closer now, though she still allowed Elena to lead the conversation. Alejandro looked toward her briefly before continuing. "I told myself the timing was wrong," he said, "that I wasn't ready to become a father." The admission carried quiet pain, but the real reason was simpler. Elena watched him carefully. Alejandro spoke again. "I didn't believe I could handle both." He looked down at his hands. "So I walked away." The room remained silent. Guests nearby understood now that they were witnessing something far more personal than a typical networking conversation. Elena absorbed his words calmly. 18 years of questions had led to this moment. She did not show anger, only quiet understanding. Because while Alejandro had spent years building an empire, she had spent those same years building a life with someone who never walked away. Her mother, Jacinta, finally stepped closer. The crowd parted slightly as she approached the small circle where Alejandro and Elena stood. Her posture remained calm, the same steady presence that had carried her through years of raising a daughter alone. Alejandro looked at her with a mixture of recognition and regret. "Jacinta," he said quietly. She nodded once. "Alejandro." For a moment neither spoke. The years between them carried more meaning than any quick greeting could express. Elena glanced between them. Jacinta then turned her attention toward Alejandro fully. "You asked earlier what happened after you left," she said. Alejandro listened carefully. "I built a life," she continued. Her voice carried no anger, only honesty. "I raised Elena, here in Brooklyn." She described the early years simply, working long hours at the cafe, studying accounting at night, taking every opportunity that helped her create stability. "Elena grew up surrounded by people who cared about her," Jacinta said. "Teachers, neighbors, friends." Alejandro lowered his eyes briefly. Jacinta continued. "She asked about you sometimes when she was younger." Elena looked down slightly at that admission. "I never filled her mind with resentment," Jacinta said. Her tone remained steady. "Because I wanted her to grow up strong, not angry." Alejandro felt the weight of those words deeply. Jacinta glanced toward Elena. "She worked hard," she said proudly. "She earned every opportunity that brought her here tonight." Alejandro nodded slowly. "I can see that." Jacinta looked back at him. "Our life didn't stop when you walked away," she said. "It moved forward." The statement carried quiet strength. Alejandro understood the meaning clearly. Success had built his world, but Jacinta had built something far more meaningful. Elena listened to both of them without interrupting. The story of her life had always come from the strength of one person, her mother. Hearing Alejandro speak now filled in the missing side of the past, but it did not change the years that had already been lived. She looked directly at him. "I didn't come here to judge you," she said calmly. Alejandro watched her carefully. Elena continued. "I just needed to hear the truth." Alejandro nodded. "You deserved that." Elena paused for a moment before speaking again. "My mom built our life with patience and hard work," she said. "She never spoke badly about you." Jacinta lowered her eyes slightly, touched by the statement. Elena turned back to Alejandro. "But knowing the truth helps me understand something." "What's that?" he asked quietly. Elena answered with surprising maturity, "That people make decisions when they're afraid." Alejandro felt the honesty in her words. "I was afraid," he admitted again. Elena nodded. "But fear doesn't erase responsibility." The statement carried no anger, only clarity. Alejandro accepted it without argument. Elena continued. "I'm proud of the life my mother built for us." Jacinta placed a gentle hand on Elena's shoulder. "And I'm proud of the person I've become," Elena added. Alejandro listened silently. For years he had believed success would eventually silence the past. Standing in front of Elena proved the opposite. Some decisions followed a person forever. Elena took a slow breath. "I'm glad I came tonight," she said. Alejandro looked at her. "So am I." But even as those words were spoken, Alejandro understood something painful. Meeting his daughter did not erase the 18 years he had missed. The gala slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Guests began speaking again, though many still glanced quietly toward the three people standing near the center of the hall. The emotional moment had shifted the energy of the room. Alejandro looked at Elena and Jacinta one more time. For years he had believed success meant reaching the top of the business world. Tonight showed him something far more complicated. Success had not erased the past. It had only delayed the moment when he would finally face it. Elena adjusted the badge on her dress. "I think we should go," she said gently to her mother. Jacinta nodded. She looked at Alejandro once more before speaking. "Take care of yourself, Alejandro." He nodded slowly. "You too." Elena met his eyes again. There was no anger in her expression, only understanding shaped by the life she had lived. "I hope you keep helping young entrepreneurs," she said. Alejandro managed a small smile. I will. Elena turned toward the exit with Jacinta beside her. Together they walked through the hall and stepped outside into the cool Brooklyn night. Across the river, the Manhattan skyline shimmered under the dark sky. The Brooklyn Bridge stretched across the water, while city lights reflected across the surface below. Inside the venue, Alejandro remained near the window. He watched the two figures walk down the quiet street, mother and daughter, the life he once walked away from. Only after they disappeared around the corner did he finally understand something clearly. Building a successful company had taken years of effort, but the people who believed in him first had always been the real foundation of his life. Before this story ends, take a moment to reflect. If this story moved you, please like the video, share your thoughts about forgiveness in the comments, and subscribe for more stories about choices, relationships, and the lessons life teaches us.